Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz, and I want to welcome you to the Schwartz Report. I was going to do something about the dreadful position we as a country are in, our democracy just on the edge of a precipice. But the more I thought about it, I thought that's all the media is covering, and I think a lot of people may be just suffering from PTSD, just overwhelmed by it because it is overwhelming. So I thought I would talk about something not quite as threatening and more interesting, perhaps, non-local consciousness and the anthropology of dreams. So I hope that this week you find this both relaxing, fascinating, and it takes your mind off for a moment what's going on in the United States. So here we go. Fascination and concern about experiences and dreams is one of humanity's oldest and most universal cultural traits. It traces back unrecorded millennia into deep time. It has been a part of our beingness, our culture, as long as as long as we know, as far back as we have records. One of the most important things culturally about dreams is that they have always been recognized as a distinct state of consciousness. And it was known that some, but not all, of the information that came from them had a source outside of space time, what today we would call non-local consciousness. Oneiromancy is the term science uses today to include all the various rituals, you can read protocols, humanity has come up with to seek insight into the future through the medium of dreams. We can trace the formal study of dreams at least as far back as the civilization of Mesopotamia in the land that lies between the Tigris and the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned between 668 and 627 BCE, felt so strongly about this that he ordered a great library to be created. And approximately 2,000 tablets and 300 writing boards, and you can see an example, framed these writings, and they have survived. The collection has come to be known as the Nineveh tablets. And here's an example of one. As a collection, it constitutes the oldest repository of learning that we have today. Some of it dates back 5,000 BCE and the dawn of civilization. And one of the major themes in the tablets of Oranomacy is about dreams. Now, in these ancient, pre-distant, pre-modern, distant periods, dreaming was always practiced and understood in a kind of religious context. Essentially, divination is a series of ritualized protocols developed empirically over generations to separate out the sublime from the mundane and to understand its meanings. One can see this wherever one looks. Persian magi, as well as Indian yogis and fakirs, developed elaborate rituals to permit themselves to experience non-local awareness and to connect with dreams. Either the Sumerians or the Egyptians formalized dream interpretation originally by creating social institutions dedicated to that purpose. And you can see, here's an Egyptian one. These were shrine sites where people would go to have dreams, because that was the explicit intention of the ritual and the place. That's what it was for. Dreamers would experience dreams containing what today we would call non-local perception. By the 4th century BCE, this linkage of dreams and non-local awareness had become completely formalized and was a central part of, for instance, the Greek religious life. At the temple of the god of healing Aesculapius, whose principal shrine was at Epidaurus on the eastern coast of the Argolid in the Mediterranean's northeastern Peloponnese in Greece. Men and women would come in to the temple in search of healing, both mental and physical, and they would seek to find this through dreams. They would sleep in a special area known as the abaton, asking for a dream. The process was called incubation. That's where the word comes from. I think it is notable that this same process is mirrored in the problem-solving techniques which are taught in mindfulness workshops today. We're doing exactly what people were doing in ancient Egyptian and Greek workshops, or temples, excuse me. The supplicant would go to sleep. The next morning, a member of the specially trained cadre of temple attendants, known as the therapeutai, from the Greek verb therapeutio, or to heal, or to serve, and that is the source of the modern term we use of therapeutics. And the therapeutai would help the dreamer interpret their dream and would establish with them a healing program from the directions the dream contained. Hippocrates, the Greek physician, whose oath of service still guides physicians to this very day, described this linkage, saying, and I quote, "The affliction suffered by the body, the soul sees quite well with the eyes shut." As with so much else that was Greek, the Romans first absorbed and then put their own stamp on these dream techniques for prophetic and diagnostic uses. Men known to possess the ability to interpret such dreams were brought to Rome as slaves by the rich and powerful. Subsequent events would validate them, and the prophet's reputation would be made. People in power would seek to have these dreams and have them interpreted for guidance as to how to run the government, basically. In the biblical history that runs as a kind of parallel universe to the formal Roman history, dreams, particularly prophetic dreams, also play a notable role. Not all dreams relate to the future in the Bible, but most do, like Daniel's interpretation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Across the centuries, working with dreams has been a manifestation of culture crouched in a religious context. For most people and most cultures throughout history, the important issue was the information in the dream, which they believed came from a god or a goddess or a spirit, depending on which culture it was. But in all cases, it's essentially non-local consciousness. Different cultures had different conceptions, but always the source was conceived of as other than the dreamer, through some connection the dreamer made in sleep to a greater wholeness. Exactly the kind of thing we do research on today. Aristotle, who in 350 BCE wrote on a text called On Dreams, an attempt, as he said, to obtain a scientific view of the nature of the dream. The rituals to invoke the dream and do the interpretation varied, and it is clear from the Ashurbanipal, the Nivea tablets. Ashurbanipal was the ruler who assembled the library. Those tablets, although they contain a lot of nonsense about beliefs, well, nonsense cultural beliefs of the time, also said if a man flies repeatedly in his dreams, whatever he owns will be lost. They were trying to figure out how this information could be interpreted, and the tablets recognized that. But it was also possible to get objectively verifiable information about the present and the future. And it happened often enough, and this is the point. People kept doing this because they got practically useful information. Oneiromancy, again the scientific term, shows up in cultures everywhere over millennia. It is one of the constants that you see, like meditation, in every culture of human history. It is only in the very recent past, however, that we have moved beyond this religious interpretation to a more scientific one. It really only dates back to the late 30s. And it started with a man capable of open-minded insight, as these things tend to do, and particularly whenever it involves consciousness. Nathaniel Kleitman was a professor of physiology at the University of Chicago, one of the very few people in the world actually doing well-grounded scientific research concerning sleep and dreams. As he describes it, he began to understand the role of dreaming in sleep by becoming aware that infants move their eyes while they're asleep. He looked at children, babies, and he said, and I quote him, "We literally stumbled on an objective method of studying dreaming." By the early 50s, Kleitman had extended his research to adults as well as infants, and was being assisted by two of his graduate students, William Dement, a medical student, and Eugene Azarinsky, doing his doctoral research in physiology. And you can see the three of them. Working in a dingy 3-room suite in South Chicago, and you can see how dingy it is, this 3-man team fundamentally changed science and our understanding of both sleep and dreaming. You don't hear much about these 3 men anymore, but they literally changed what we understood about sleep, dreaming, and consciousness. While monitoring sleeping infants, Azarinsky realized that there were electrical signals coming off of their brains associated with the eye movements that they had observed. These could be monitored, he'd figured out, by the same electroencephalograph, EEG techniques used to follow brain waves that had been pioneered by Johann Berger 2 decades earlier. They called these rapid eye movements REM sleep, REM. And when you look in the scientific literature, you'll see lots of references to REM sleep because once they discovered it and realized that it was associated with dreaming, the term was developed and used throughout medicine and science. Initially, they were unclear what it meant in infants and did not yet know whether similar activity occurred in adults. But as they examined sleeping people, they confirmed that that was the case. But the question was, were REM events just random muscular activity, or were they connected to a particular state of consciousness? Dement, in particular, was interested in exploring whether there was a connection between these eye movements and dreams. And in 1953, during a series of all-night recording sessions, as the volunteers slept, he observed that the sleepers' eye movements were not just random muscular activity. Their eyes seemed to move as if they were actually watching something. This activity came in cycles throughout the night and was associated with consistent, predictable brain activity. When they awakened these people during these REM periods, they discovered that when their eyes were moving and they were having one of these REM periods, that they were dreaming. And they found that linkage. These findings help to establish that there are two distinct states of sleep: REM, REM, random eye movement, and non-REM, NREM, and that there are 4 stages of non-REM sleep in addition to the REM periods. Dement concluded that everybody, without exception, had the same pattern of sleep. This is a big deal, and if you have trouble sleeping or you wake up after dreaming, this will all make very helpful sense. This was a major discovery. In some cases, the 8-hour pattern from one night's recordings could be superimposed almost perfectly on the pattern of another night. Dement said he realized that during REM, the brain acts as if it were awake, even though the rest of the body lies still. Alan Rechtschaffen, a later sleep researcher at the University of Chicago, discovered that the fruits of this research could result in a transformation in medicine, what he called a grand scientific revolution, which started with the discovery of REM sleep. Today, thousands of physicians and other scientists are actively adding to the original insights of Kleitman, Dement, and Azarinsky. And a search on dreams will yield, if you go to PubMed, thousands of citations. Most of this has to do with the physiology of sleep and dreams. 2 of the many researchers stimulated by this work, however, saw deeper. Psychiatrist Montague Ullman and psychologist Stanley Krippner, who together headed the Dream Laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center in New York City, asked a question every pre-scientific culture had taken as a given. Was it possible in a dream state to acquire objectively verifiable non-local information? In the late 1960s and into the 70s, Ullman and Krippner, assisted by Alan Vaughan and Charles Honorton, took the findings of Kleitman, Dement, and Azarinsky and carried out a pioneering series of experiments exploring the connection between non-local awareness, they called it telepathy, and dreaming. Recognizing that the linkage worked best when there was a sense of personal connection, the individual who would hold the image, that is, someone would think about an image or think about a target, and the dreamer who would attempt to open to it, would spend some time together so that they could become acquainted. Then the dreamer would be wired up, go to sleep in a special sound attenuated room so that nothing external would startle them, or which might create false readings. And when the sleeper's brain pattern indicated they were dreaming and their eyes were moving behind their closed lids, the wakeful partner who was holding this image would open an envelope which contained a picture and attempt to link with the dreamer while looking at this image. And after a few minutes, or when the REM stopped, the dreamer would be awakened and asked to describe their dream. What they discovered was that when they did this, the results produced a significant correlation between the image held by the wakeful partner and the imagery in the dream. The researchers also discovered dreams often contained a kind of precognitive information, exactly what had so fascinated every culture from the beginning of antiquity and recorded history. This work established that a form of remote viewing, really, that's what I would call it today, non-local linkage, is possible even when one is asleep. Much of these findings were confirmed by Charles Tart, a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who also showed that many activities, including doing scientific research, involve specific states of consciousness, and changed the thinking of many scientists, including myself, by noting that states of consciousness exist. It's not just all one thing. Today, we talk about altered states of consciousness and meditation, mindfulness. All seems, well, sort of, oh, doesn't everybody know that? And the answer is, when Tart was doing his research in Montague and Ullman, no, everybody did not know that, although the ancients had known it, but it had been lost for centuries as science developed. A few years after Montague and Ullman and Alan Vaughan and the others, the dream research moved into yet a new plateau when a Stanford researcher, Stephen LaBerge, began to study the often reported but virtually unstudied state that he called lucid dreaming. And you may have had such a dream. Typically, you wake up in your dream and can take control of what happens. For a long time, it wasn't recognized that lucid dreaming was, in fact, a distinct state of consciousness. But LaBerge, through a series of very ingenious experiments, proved that it was. A physicist at Stanford Research Institute knew LaBerge and correctly saw that if he was right in his conclusions, LaBerge, then it ought to be possible to actually do a formal remote viewing from a dream state, just as if the viewer were conventionally awake. And LaBerge and May devised an experiment in which a person would awaken into what LaBerge called lucidity and perform a standard remote viewing of the randomly selected target, just an even more sophisticated version of what Ullman and Krippner were doing. The viewer that would then be awakened in the usual sense and asked to describe their viewings. And the results surprised even LaBerge and May, who thought that they had a handle on most of the aspects of remote viewing. People were clearly able to wake up in their dreams, take control, and carry out specific non-local tasks, remote viewing, producing session data that looked just as it would if they were awake. Now, here's an example. To the left, you see the picture that was the target. To the right, you see what the dreamer, a very talented remote viewer named Joe McMonigal, drew. Look at the similarity in what the target and the dreamer's drawing look like. Most recently, psychologist Lance Storm of the University of Adelaide in Australia led an international team of researchers in doing an exhaustive meta-analytic study on experimental dream ESP studies between 1966 and 2016. And they found 40 dream ESP studies, totaling 52 data sets, conducted by 51 different experimenters. And this is important because it wasn't something one particular researcher was finding. This was something that researcher after researcher for years were discovering, the same thing, that they felt were sufficiently rigorous in both design and execution to include. And using the most sophisticated frequentist and Bayesian statistics for their analysis, they concluded that the dream content can be used to identify target materials correctly and more often than would be expected by chance. In the literature of science, the ability to assess non-local information in dreams is still being dismissed by some as magical thinking. But increasingly, it becomes very clear that something else is going on, and that the spectrum of non-local consciousness must now include not just things like remote viewing or mediumship or channeling or experiences in meditation, but also experiences in dreaming. There's quite a lot of literature on this, so if you're interested, as usual, I provide sources that you can check and dig further into, and you may find that you can use this information in your own dream experience, and that it's possible for everyone to have these experiences. Just as I have previously told you that in meditation, people of any culture, religion can have these experiences. So I hope this was a little break from what's going on in our country, and that it will help you work with your own consciousness path. Thank you.